Here are the keys.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Enjoy the place.
I'm sure I will. Thanks again.
Anytime. See you.
You can stay for 30 days, miss. But in this house, no one eats alone. The words left Ethan Hale before he could stop them, quiet and steady, the kind of sentence a man learns to say only after life has taken everything loud from him. The girl standing on his porch looked too young for the weight in her eyes and too polished for the peeling white trim of his weathered house on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio. Her suitcase was small, her denim jacket neat, her sneakers clean in a way that made the muddy gravel beneath them seem almost rude. She introduced herself as Claire Bennett, a college sophomore from Columbus who needed a cheap room near campus after a sudden housing problem. She spoke politely, almost carefully, like someone choosing each word not for truth alone, but for safety. Ethan noticed that first. Not her beauty, though she had the kind that never needed to ask for attention. Not the way the late October wind lifted a strand of golden brown hair across her cheek. He noticed the caution. And caution, Ethan knew, was what people wore when life had taught them that kindness often came with a bill. Ethan was 39, broad-shouldered from years of carpentry, with rough hands, tired blue eyes, and the kind of quiet that made strangers mistake him for simple. 3 years earlier, he had buried his wife, Hannah, after a long fight with a sickness that drained not only the savings account, but the color from every room in the house. Since then, he had been father and mother to 8-year-old Lily, a bright little girl with a missing front tooth, a collection of library books by her bed, and a habit of asking whether heaven had porches where people could sit and watch the rain. Ethan worked 6 days a week restoring old homes and fixing whatever the town could not fix alone. He patched roofs, rebuilt stairs, and stretched every dollar until it begged for mercy. The room upstairs had once been Hannah's sewing room. He had kept the door closed for almost 2 years. Then the furnace needed replacing, Lily outgrew her winter coat, and Mercy started looking a lot like rent. So when Claire answered the handwritten notice pinned on the board at Tucker's grocery, Ethan told himself this was practical, nothing more. 1 room, shared kitchen, rent due every Friday. No trouble. But trouble did not always arrive wearing anger. Sometimes it arrived looking fragile. Claire Bennett was 20, though something in her face made her seem older in the quiet moments and younger when she smiled by accident. She had enrolled at Hawthorne College under a name that drew no attention, paid cash for her first week, and carried only 1 suitcase, 1 backpack, and a silence too expensive to belong to an ordinary girl. What Ethan did not know, what no one in Millbrook could have guessed, was that Claire was not running from poverty, but from privilege sharp enough to wound. She was the only daughter of Richard Bennett, a billionaire hotel magnate whose name hung over towers of glass from New York to Los Angeles. To the country, she was a society page ghost who had not been photographed in nearly a year. To her father, she was a disappointment who wanted a life not purchased in advance. To herself, she was a young woman tired of bodyguards, banquet rooms, and men who heard her last name before they heard her voice. By the time Ethan stepped aside and let her in, the house smelled like chicken soup, sawdust, and cinnamon from the candle Lily insisted made the place feel rich. Claire paused in the doorway as if she had crossed into a memory she had never actually lived. Ethan took her suitcase without fanfare. Lily peeked around the hallway corner in pink socks and stared at the college girl like she had stepped out of one of her chapter books. Outside, the sky darkened over the maple trees, and the old house gave its usual sigh against the wind. Inside, something softer began, not with thunder, not with music, but with the sound of a tired father making room for a stranger and a rich man's daughter seeing, for the first time in years, what home might feel like. The first dinner Claire shared with them felt less like a meal and more like a test no one admitted was happening. Lily talked enough for 3 people, swinging her feet beneath the table and asking whether college girls really drank coffee at midnight and used words like thesis in casual conversation. Claire smiled at that, a real smile this time, brief but warm, and said only during finals. Ethan set out chipped bowls of chicken soup, slices of buttered bread, and apple slices arranged the way Hannah used to do for Lily when money was tight, and she wanted supper to feel like care instead of compromise. Claire thanked him twice, once when he handed her the bowl, and again after the first spoonful, as though she had not expected food to taste like someone had made it for her on purpose. Ethan noticed small things because years of grief had taught him that the heart spoke in details. Claire folded her napkin in her lap before eating. She glanced at the front window every time headlights moved across the road. She kept her phone face down on the table and flinched only once when it buzzed, then silenced it without reading the screen. There was polish in her manners, but fear in her habits. That combination made no sense unless a person had come from somewhere expensive enough to hide danger behind perfect curtains. After dinner, Ethan carried the bowls to the sink, while Lily gave Claire a tour of the house with the seriousness of a tiny landlord. From the kitchen doorway, he could hear her proud little voice pointing out the loose stair that squeaked in winter, the bathroom faucet that needed a firm left turn, and the bookshelf in the upstairs hall where guests were free to borrow any novel as long as they respected mysteries. Claire laughed softly, and the sound surprised the house. It had been a long time since laughter from a grown woman had drifted down those stairs. Ethan stood still with his hands under warm dishwater, feeling that strange ache that comes when something lost is not returning, but something new is quietly asking permission to enter. Later, once Lily was asleep and the old floorboards had settled into night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a ledger, a pencil, and the unpaid arithmetic of ordinary survival. Furnace balance. Grocery bill. Lily's school field trip due next Friday. He rubbed his jaw and stared at the numbers until they blurred. Upstairs, he heard Claire's footsteps move slowly across the room. Then stop, then move again. Not the restless pacing of someone on the phone or the heavy steps of a careless tenant. These were measured, uncertain steps, like she still did not believe she was allowed to belong in the space she had rented. A moment later, there was a soft knock at the kitchen door frame. Claire stood there in a borrowed sweatshirt Lily had insisted she wear because the upstairs room got cold near the windows. Her hair was loose now, falling over one shoulder, and whatever armor she had arrived in seemed thinner under the yellow kitchen light. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. Ethan looked up from the ledger. "Not unless you know how to make these numbers behave." She stepped closer, glanced at the page, and for 1 second something changed in her expression, not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. The kind that comes from someone who understands money too well. Then she reached into her pocket and placed a folded envelope on the table. "Extra for the first month," she said quietly, "for the inconvenience of moving in on short notice." Ethan frowned and did not touch it. "Claire, the rent we agreed on is enough." She met his eyes, calm but tense. "Please." Ethan studied her for a long moment, the envelope between them like a question with no safe answer. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows. Inside, under the low kitchen light, he realized this college girl was carrying more than a suitcase into his home. She was carrying a secret heavy enough to make generosity feel like an apology. Claire kept her hand on the envelope, as if the paper itself might steady her. Ethan leaned back in the kitchen chair and shook his head once, not harshly, but with the quiet firmness of a man who had learned that some lines, once crossed, changed the meaning of everything. "We made an agreement," he said. "A room upstairs. Shared meals if you want them. Rent every Friday. That is enough." Claire's fingers tightened around the fold. For a second, she looked almost frustrated, though not at him. At herself, maybe. At the strange discomfort of hearing no from someone who did not want anything from her except honesty. "Most people would take it," she said softly. Ethan gave a tired half-smile. "Most people got more bills than sense." She looked down, and the corner of her mouth moved like she nearly smiled too. Then, with a small nod, she slipped the envelope back into her pocket. The kitchen fell into a hush broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock Hannah had once painted pale blue because she said every house needed one cheerful thing that did not ask permission. Claire's eyes drifted to the family photo on the shelf above the sink. Ethan, younger and less weathered, stood with one arm around Hannah and the other around a toddler Lily in overalls, all three of them laughing at something outside the frame. Claire stared at it longer than politeness required. "Your wife?" she asked at last. Ethan followed her gaze. "Yeah, Hannah." Claire nodded slowly, and the room seemed to soften around the name. "She was beautiful," she said. Ethan looked at the photo, then at the ledger, then back at nothing in particular. She was the kind of person who made a place feel warmer before she even touched the thermostat. Claire let out the smallest breath, almost a laugh, almost grief. My mother used to do that, she said. Ethan lifted his eyes. Used to. Claire crossed her arms lightly over herself, not defensive, just holding in a draft he could not feel. She died when I was 16. After that, every room got bigger and colder, even the expensive ones. Ethan said nothing right away. Some pain did not need fixing. It needed witness. Finally, he nodded toward the kettle on the stove. Tea. Claire hesitated, then said yes. He rose, filled the kettle, and set it on the burner. In the simple ritual of mugs and steam, the distance between landlord and tenant loosened into something more human. Claire perched on the edge of the chair opposite him, her shoulders less rigid now. She did not say who her mother had been or where she had grown up, but Ethan could tell from her phrasing, from the careful education in her voice, from the way sorrow sat so neatly on her, that her world had not been ordinary. Still, ordinary was what she seemed hungry for. A warm kitchen after 10. A conversation no one recorded. A man who did not ask what her last name could buy. Upstairs, the floor creaked. Then tiny footsteps pattered across the hallway. Lily appeared in dinosaur pajamas, hair tangled, blanket dragging behind her like a train. Daddy, she mumbled. I had the bad dream again. Ethan's chair scraped back at once. He knelt beside her, brushing hair from her face. The wolves one or the hospital one? The hospital one, she whispered. Claire turned away for a moment, giving them privacy with the kind of instinct that came from understanding fragile things. Ethan scooped Lily into his arms with practiced ease. It's okay, Peanut. You're home. Lily rested her head on his shoulder, then peered sleepily at Claire. Are you staying? She asked. Claire looked up, caught off guard. For a little while, she answered. Lily nodded as if this were a serious contract, then tucked her face against Ethan's neck. Good, she murmured. The house sounds less lonely. Ethan stood there holding his daughter in the middle of that worn kitchen, the kettle beginning to sing on the stove, and across from him sat a girl with expensive sorrow in her eyes and nowhere safe to put it. In that moment, neither of them knew it yet, but the room upstairs was no longer the only thing Claire Bennett had rented. She had stepped, quietly and dangerously, into the aching heart of a family that still remembered how to love. The next morning arrived under a sky the color of brushed steel, with cold rain tapping softly against the kitchen windows and the smell of toast rising through the small house, like a promise modest but sincere. Ethan was up before dawn, as always, packing Lily's lunch at the counter while the coffee maker sputtered through its tired routine. Peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, pretzels in a plastic bag he had washed and reused twice already. The quiet had shapen that hour. It lived in the yellow light over the sink, in the worn seat cushion at the breakfast table, in the steady discipline of a man who had built his life out of showing up even when joy was not guaranteed. Claire came downstairs just after 6:30, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, wearing jeans and the same borrowed sweatshirt, though. She somehow made it look more thoughtful than temporary. She paused at the kitchen entrance as if afraid to interrupt the fragile rhythm of a real home in motion. Morning, Ethan said, not turning from the lunchbox he was closing. Coffee's fresh if you want some. Claire nodded and poured herself a cup, then watched as he tucked a handwritten note into Lily's lunch. She tilted her head. Do you always do that? Ethan looked up. Most days. Claire wrapped both hands around the mug. What do you write? Depends on the morning, he said. Sometimes just be brave. Sometimes save me one of your smiles for after school. Claire's expression changed at that, not dramatically, but enough for Ethan to notice. The kind of change that happened when a person encountered a form of love they had not realized they missed. A few minutes later, the upstairs hallway burst into motion. Lily came down in leggings, a purple raincoat half-buttoned, backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her hair on the left side was neatly brushed. The right side looked like she had argued with a thundercloud and lost. Ethan caught her gently by the elbow and turned her toward him. Hold still, he said, reaching for the brush on the counter. Lily groaned with theatrical suffering. Daddy, I'm already late for being early. Claire let out a soft laugh into her coffee. Ethan smiled despite himself and worked through the tangle with careful hands. This was part of fatherhood too, not the grand sacrifices people praised in church speeches, but the daily, nearly invisible tenderness of lunch notes and wet boots and hair ribbons found under couches. Claire stood by the window watching it, and for the first time since she had arrived, Ethan saw something almost unguarded in her face. Not envy, more like longing with manners. The drive to Pine Hollow Elementary took 15 minutes on roads slick with rain and scattered maple leaves. Claire had offered to walk to campus later, so Ethan told her to make herself at home and lock the door behind him. She nodded from the porch as he helped Lily into the truck, one hand shielding the child's head from the rain though the truck roof was only inches away. At the school entrance, children spilled from minivans and pickups in bright jackets, lunchboxes swinging, teachers calling cheerful instructions over the weather. Lily unbuckled, then hesitated with her hand on the door. "Daddy," she asked quietly, "is Claire sad?" Ethan turned off the engine and looked at his daughter. "Why do you ask?" Lily shrugged in the solemn way children do when they have stumbled onto truth before adults have named it. "Because her eyes are nice, but tired." Ethan sat for a beat, rain tapping the windshield in thin silver lines. "Sometimes grown-ups carry things they don't talk about yet," he said. Lily thought about that as if filing it somewhere important. Then she nodded. "Maybe I can show her my frog collection after school." Ethan smiled. "That might help more than you know." She leaned across the seat and kissed his cheek before hopping down into the rain, backpack bobbing behind her as she ran toward the school doors. Ethan watched until she disappeared inside, then drove to his first job site with Lily's question still in his chest. Back at the house, Claire stood alone in the upstairs room, looking out over the wet yard, the old swing beneath the maple tree, and the life below her window that ran on effort instead of image. On the bed beside her, her phone lit up again with the same private number that had called 3 times the night before. This time it left a message. Her father's voice was clipped, controlled, and colder than the rain outside. "Claire, enough of this. You come home today, or I come find you." She stared at the screen, face pale in the dim room, and downstairs the little house settled around her with a warmth that suddenly felt as fragile as it was precious. Claire listened to the voicemail twice, not because she needed to hear the words again, but because tone often revealed what language tried to hide. Her father sounded controlled, which in Richard Bennett's world meant angry enough to become dangerous in a polite suit. She stood motionless in the upstairs room while rain slipped down the glass in thin, crooked lines, turning the yard below into a watercolor of wet grass, bare branches, and the rusted swing Lily still loved as if childhood itself could keep metal from aging. For a long moment Claire said nothing. Then she pressed delete, set the phone face down on the dresser, and exhaled like someone trying to breathe quietly inside a locked chapel. Downstairs, the old house answered with ordinary sounds. The refrigerator humming, a loose pipe ticking once in the wall. The kind of modest life noise that would have been mocked in the world she came from, where silence was curated by architects and staff, where grief wore better fabrics and still somehow felt colder. Here, even fear had the decency to arrive honestly. Claire should have left. That was the practical choice. Pack the suitcase. Walk to the bus station. Disappear before Richard Bennett's private security teams turned a carpenter's home into a problem to be managed. But practical had never once made her feel human. She went downstairs instead. In the kitchen, Ethan had left behind the aftermath of a rushed morning, one cereal bowl in the sink, Lily's hairbrush on the counter, a flannel jacket draped over the back of a chair. Claire stood in the middle of it all with her arms folded, staring at the small note Ethan had forgotten beside the bread box. "Save me one of your smiles for after school." She picked it up carefully, as if kindness could bruise under the wrong touch. No one had written her notes like that in years. In her father's homes, every message had been logistical. Car at 8. Press delayed. Smile for the donors. Where Navy. Even affection had always sounded scheduled. By noon the rain had thinned to a silver mist. Claire walked to Hawthorne College with her hood up and her thoughts louder than the traffic. Campus moved around her in the usual rhythm of mid-semester America. Students in hoodies balancing coffee trays, bikes chained to slick railings, flyers taped to brick walls advertising poetry nights, and tutoring jobs, and intramural volleyball. Claire blended easily there. That had been the point. No chauffeur. No security detail. No Bennett Foundation scholarship plaque with her family name carved into marble. Just one more student carrying books and pretending the world could not find her if she acted ordinary. Enough. In Intro to American Literature, she took notes she would never look at because her mind kept slipping back to the kitchen, to Ethan's voice, to Lily asking if she liked pancakes shaped like stars. Halfway through class, her friend Marissa slid into the empty seat beside her and whispered, "You look like you got bad news," and tried to dress it in a cute jacket. Claire almost smiled. Marissa was one of the few people on campus who knew Claire came from money, though not how much. "Family stuff," Claire murmured. Marissa studied her for a second. "The real kind." Claire nodded once. After class, they stood beneath the stone overhang outside Emerson Hall while students hurried through the drizzle toward the library quad. Marissa sipped iced coffee she refused to give up even in cold weather and lowered her voice. "Are you safe where you're staying?" Claire hesitated. The truth rose before she could stop it. "Safer than I've felt in a long time." Marissa's expression softened. "Then hold on to that. People spend their whole lives not finding a place that feels like peace." Claire looked out at the wet campus, at the rows of brick buildings glowing dark with rain, and thought of Ethan driving from one repair job to the next in that old truck, probably skipping lunch to save money, probably checking the clock around 3 because Lily got out at 3:15 and being late to her mattered more than any invoice. She thought of the way he had refused her extra money without hesitation, as though dignity cost more than convenience, and he intended to keep his. By the time she walked back to the house near dusk, the porch light was already on, casting a warm gold circle over the steps. Through the front window, she could see Lily at the table in her school clothes, drawing something with fierce concentration while Ethan stood at the stove, stirring a pot with one hand and helping her spell a word with the other. Claire stopped on the walkway and simply watched. It was such a small scene, so unremarkable by the standards of the world she had fled, and yet it hit her harder than any gala, any penthouse view, any luxury she had ever been handed without love attached. Inside that house was struggle, yes, bills, weariness, a furnace that coughed and windows that leaked, and a father doing twice the work for half the comfort. But there was also something her billionaire childhood had rarely managed to buy. There was peace. And as Claire stood there in the fading Ohio light, with her father's warning still echoing in memory, she realized the danger was no longer just that Richard Bennett might find her. The greater danger was that she might already care too much to leave. Claire stepped inside just as Lily looked up from the table and gasped like someone spotting a long-awaited guest in a storybook. "You came back," she said with complete seriousness, as if Claire had been gone for weeks instead of one rainy school day. Claire slipped off her damp jacket and smiled, something tender moving through her chest at the simple certainty in the child's voice. "I did," she said. Lily held up her drawing at once. It was a crooked but earnest picture of the three of them standing beneath the maple tree in the yard, with Ethan drawn taller than the trunk and Claire wearing what looked suspiciously like a yellow crown. "That's you," Lily explained, pointing proudly. "Not because you're a princess. Because you look like you forgot one, and I thought maybe you needed it back." Ethan, standing at the stove in a faded gray t-shirt, let out a quiet laugh into the steam rising from the pot. Claire took the picture with both hands, careful, almost reverent. "It's beautiful," she said. Lily squinted. "You don't have to say that just because I'm little." Claire's smile deepened. "I'm saying it because it made me feel seen." That answer seemed to satisfy Lily, who nodded and returned to coloring the maple leaves bright red, even though most of the real ones had already turned brown and dropped. Supper that night was beef stew, thick and humble, the kind that asked only for bread and hunger. Ethan served the bowls while Lily filled the glasses with milk and nearly spilled half of one in her concentration. Claire offered to help, but Ethan shook his head toward the table. "Guest rule. First week, you sit. Second week, you can argue." Claire raised an eyebrow. "And if I win the argument?" Ethan set down the last bowl and looked at her with that calm, unreadable humor of his. "Then I'll pretend it was my idea." Lily giggled so hard she snorted into her napkin, and for one bright second the kitchen felt full in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. They ate under the soft yellow light with rain still whispering against the windows. Lily talked about school, about a spelling test, about how Mrs. Donnelly said frogs were amphibians and not just pond goblins with manners. Ethan corrected homework between bites and reminded her not to wave her spoon like a conductor. Claire mostly listened, but little by little, the listening turned into answering. She told Lily that college libraries smelled better than most perfume counters. She admitted she had once gotten lost in Chicago for 3 hours trying to find an art museum her mother loved. She even laughed when Ethan described his first attempt at packing Lily's kindergarten lunch, which had included a whole onion because in the dark he had mistaken it for an apple. The laughter came easier now, but it still carried fragility, as if joy were something Claire had to relearn in portions small enough not to frighten her. After dinner, while Lily worked on a school project at the table, Ethan rinsed dishes and Claire dried them. It happened naturally, without permission, like two people stepping into the rhythm of a life that had room for one more pair of hands. Their elbows brushed once near the sink. Claire moved back too quickly. "Sorry," she said. Ethan handed her a plate without looking flustered. "House is small. Bound to happen." But there was a beat afterward, brief and electric, and both of them felt it. Claire dried the plate more slowly than necessary. Ethan ran water over a spoon he had already rinsed. Across the kitchen, Lily hummed to herself while cutting out construction paper stars. The ordinary sweetness of the moment should have made Claire feel safe. Instead, it made her afraid in a new way. Because peace, once felt, could be lost. And she knew too well that her father had never believed in leaving anything valuable unattended. Later that evening, after Lily was tucked into bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime creaks, headlights swept across the front curtains and stopped. Claire froze halfway up the stairs. Ethan, who had been locking the back door, looked toward the window at the same time. Outside, at the curb, sat a black sedan too sleek for Millbrook, its engine idling low in the dark like a warning that had finally learned their address. The sedan stayed there for 3 full minutes without a door opening, without a horn, without any movement except the faint pulse of brake lights glowing red through the rain-dark street. Ethan stepped closer to the front window, not enough to be seen clearly, just enough to study the shape of trouble before it knocked. Claire stood frozen on the stairs, one hand gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. In the hush between them, the house seemed suddenly aware of its own thin walls, its old locks, its smallness. Ethan did not turn around when he spoke. "You know them." It was not a question. Claire swallowed. Her voice came out low. "Maybe." That one word told him more than panic ever could. Ethan kept his eyes on the car a second longer, then reached over and drew the curtain fully shut. The gesture was simple, almost gentle, but it changed the room. It said this house has boundaries. It said whatever comes to the door will not come all the way in. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Both of them looked toward the hallway at once. Lily. She had not come down yet, but children had a way of sensing when the air in a house changed temperature. Ethan lowered his voice. "Go upstairs. Make sure she stays in her room." Claire did not move right away. Ethan finally looked at her, calm and steady in a way that made the fear around them seem louder by contrast. "Claire," he said softly, "go." She nodded and hurried up the stairs, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Lily was already sitting up in bed when Claire stepped into the room, stuffed frog tucked beneath one arm, hair mussed from sleep. Her wide eyes moved at once to Claire's face. "Is something wrong?" Claire crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, forcing warmth into her voice. "Just a car outside, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." Lily studied her with the unnerving seriousness children sometimes carried, as if they had borrowed wisdom from somewhere older than language. Is it the kind of nothing grown-ups say when it's actually something? Claire almost broke at that. Instead, she brushed a strand of hair from Lily's forehead and smiled the best smile she could manage. "It's the kind of something your dad can handle." That answer seemed to settle her, though not completely. Lily clutched the frog. "Daddy handles most things." Claire looked toward the door, where Ethan's footsteps moved below, measured and unhurried. "Yes," she whispered. "I think he does." Downstairs, the front doorbell rang. One sharp note, then silence. Ethan did not rush. He crossed the living room, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door only halfway. Rain-cooled air slipped inside, carrying the scent of wet pavement and expensive cologne. On the porch stood a man in a charcoal overcoat, umbrella held by a second man a step behind him. Both were clean-cut, broad-shouldered, and entirely wrong for this neighborhood. The first man offered a professional smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Hale." Ethan kept one hand on the door. "Depends who's asking." The man nodded slightly, as though confirming a detail in a file. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I represent Mr. Richard Bennett. We're here regarding Miss Claire Bennett." Ethan's expression did not change, but something inside him sharpened. Upstairs, Claire closed her eyes. There it was. The name finally spoken in the little house like a polished knife set on a farmhouse table. Mercer continued in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Miss Bennet's family is very concerned. Her father would appreciate her immediate return. Ethan let the silence stretch a beat longer than comfort allowed. Then he said, Claire is not a package you can pick up off a porch. Mercer's smile thinned. With respect, sir, this is a private family matter. Ethan's voice stayed even. Then the family can discuss it with her, not with me. A second figure moved at the sidewalk near the sedan, another suited man scanning the property with practiced detachment. Ethan noticed that and understood enough. This was not concern. This was retrieval. Behind him, the stairs gave the softest creak. He did not turn, but he knew Claire was there now. Out of Lily's room and standing just beyond the living room archway, drawn by the sound of her father's world arriving dressed in legal manners. Mercer saw her over Ethan's shoulder and straightened at once. Miss Bennet, thank God. Your father has been worried sick. Claire stepped forward just enough to be seen, her face pale but composed. Don't do that, she said. Don't use his worry to make control sound like love. The rain tapped steadily on the porch roof. Mercer's polished mask slipped for half a second. Miss Bennet, your father asked us to bring you home tonight. Claire lifted her chin. Then you can tell my father something he's never liked hearing. No. Upstairs, in the dim hallway, Lily stood hugging her frog and watching from the shadows, small and silent, while below her the man who had rented a room to a stranger stood like a wall between that child's home and the billion-dollar storm at the door. For one suspended moment, no one on the porch moved. The rain softened to a fine silver mist, and the world seemed to hold its breath around the small house on Maple Street. Ethan felt the tension before he named it, not just in Claire's voice or Mercer's sharpened jaw, but in the fragile quiet behind him, where Lily was somewhere on the stairs hearing grown-up danger through the filter of a child's fear. Ethan stepped slightly wider into the doorway, not aggressive, not dramatic, just enough to make the shape of his refusal unmistakable. Mr. Mercer, he said, if Claire says no, then tonight that's the end of the conversation. Mercer's polished restraint cracked a fraction. Sir, with respect, you don't understand the family involved. Ethan's eyes stayed level. I understand enough to know she doesn't want to go with you. Behind Mercer, the second man shifted beneath the umbrella, clearly unused to being stalled by a carpenter in worn jeans and a house with peeling paint. The whole scene had the strange unreality of two worlds meeting in the wrong weather. One built on leverage, access, and signatures. The other built on a deadbolt, a soup pot, and the belief that no meant no. Claire took another step forward until she stood beside the archway, still inside the living room, still under Ethan's roofline. Her voice was steadier now, strengthened by the fact that someone had not folded the moment money arrived. I told my father I needed space, she said. He sent a surveillance team instead. Mercer gave a thin exhale through his nose. Your father is concerned for your safety. Claire almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. My father is concerned for his image. Upstairs, Lily shifted, and the old stair groaned softly beneath her weight. Ethan turned his head just enough to catch sight of her small figure in the shadows, frog pressed to her chest, eyes too wide for this hour. His expression changed at once. The firmness remained, but something gentler moved beneath it, the part of him that answered first to fatherhood and only then to conflict. Lily, he said quietly, go back to bed, Peanut. Lily did not move. Is Claire in trouble? She asked, her voice small but clear enough to cut through every adult pretense in the room. Claire's face softened with pain. Mercer looked briefly uncomfortable, as if children made these situations less elegant than the Bennett family preferred. Ethan kept his voice calm. Not if I can help it. That answer seemed to land in Lily's chest like something solid. She nodded once and disappeared back toward the hallway, though no one believed she had gone far. Mercer glanced toward the street where the sedan still idled. Then he reached into his coat and produced a business card. His tone cooled into corporate steel. Mr. Bennett is prepared to compensate you generously for any inconvenience caused by Miss Bennett's temporary stay here. Claire closed her eyes. There it was, the old language. Money is solvent. Money is eraser. Money is a way to avoid the moral embarrassment of being told no by ordinary people. Ethan looked at the card but did not take it. His mouth set in that same tired, honorable line Claire had begun to recognize. You should leave, he said. Mercer held the card out another second. You may want to reconsider. Ethan's gaze never dropped. No, sir. I really don't. The rain tapped softly against the porch rail. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and fell silent. Mercer finally withdrew the card and tucked it back into his coat with the clipped precision of a man not used to having his script rejected. He looked past Ethan one last time. Miss Bennett, your father will not enjoy being ignored. Claire's voice came back low and clear. He should have learned by now that I'm not one of his hotels. He doesn't get to own the room just because he paid to build it. Something in Mercer's expression hardened at that, but he merely inclined his head, turned, and stepped off the porch. The second man followed. Their shoes clicked against the wet path with expensive finality. Ethan waited until both men were inside the sedan and the black car had pulled away into the Ohio night before he closed the door and locked it. The click of the deadbolt sounded small, almost ordinary, but to Claire it felt like grace. She stood very still in the living room, breathing shallowly, one hand pressed to her ribs, as if her heart had become something physical she needed to contain. Ethan turned toward her, his face composed, though the strain around his eyes had deepened. You okay? He asked. Claire looked at him, at the worn flannel on the chair, at the child's crayons on the table, at the man who had just stood between her and a billion-dollar machine with nothing but decency and a front porch. No one had done that for her in years. Maybe ever. Her voice shook despite her best effort. Why would you do that? Ethan frowned slightly, as if the answer were too obvious to deserve ceremony. Because this is my house, he said, and nobody gets dragged out of it while my daughter's trying to sleep. Claire stared at him, and in the hush that followed, she understood something with terrifying clarity. She had come to Millbrook to hide. But somewhere between the lunch notes, the soup bowls, and the sound of a little girl saying the house felt less lonely, she had found the kind of man her father's world could never manufacture. And now that world had seen him too. After the sedan disappeared into the rain, the house did not return to normal all at once. Peace, Ethan had learned, never rushed back through a door just because danger had left the porch. It returned in layers. In the soft groan of settling floorboards. In the kettle he put back on without thinking. In the small domestic rituals that told frightened hearts they were still inside a life, not just inside a moment. Claire remained near the archway, pale and still, one hand pressed lightly against her ribs. The strength she had used to face Mercer had not vanished, but it had become costly. Ethan saw that. He also saw the upstairs hallway, dark now except for the slice of light under Lily's bedroom door. Trouble could wait one more minute. Fatherhood could not. He looked at Claire and spoke in the same low voice he used when storms rolled in too hard over Millbrook. Sit down. I'm going to check on Lily. Claire nodded at once, and there was something in her eyes that looked almost like apology, almost like gratitude, almost like grief. Ethan climbed the stairs slowly, his hand trailing the banister polished smooth by years of use. Halfway up he passed a framed school photo of Lily in first grade, front teeth too big, smile too brave. Hannah used to say children should never feel the full weight of adult fear if love could stand in front of it first. Ethan had failed at many things since losing her. He had burned dinners, forgotten spirit days, stretched bills too far, snapped once or twice from exhaustion and hated himself afterward. But this one vow he guarded like flame. Whatever happened outside, whatever tried to enter, he would always go back to his daughter. He would always return to her room, to her questions, to the soft night light glowing beside her bed. Lily was awake when he entered, sitting cross-legged under her blanket with the stuffed frog in her lap. She looked smaller at night, though somehow wiser too. Is Claire staying? She asked before he could speak. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and brushed a hand over her hair. Yes, Peanut. She's staying. Lily searched his face with those clear, steady eyes children carried before the world taught them how to hide concern. Were those bad men? Ethan chose his words carefully. They were people who forgot how to listen when someone says no. Lily considered that, then frowned in the serious way she did when building her private rules about the world. That's rude. Ethan smiled, tired and real. Yeah, it is. She shifted closer and leaned against his arm. You came back, she murmured. He looked down at her. Of course I did. Even if something scary happens. Even then. Especially then. Lily nodded as if this were not comfort, but law. something permanent as gravity. Good, she whispered, because when you come back, the house feels right again. The words landed in Ethan's chest with quiet force. He thought of all the nights since Hannah died, all the times he had sat in the truck after work trying to gather enough strength to walk inside smiling. All the mornings he had packed lunches while pretending the numbers in his head were not crushing him. None of it had been elegant. None of it had been easy. But somehow, for Lily, his returning had become the architecture of safety. He kissed her forehead, waited until her breathing slowed, and sat there a little longer, watching the night light paint a soft circle on the wall. Downstairs, Claire stood by the kitchen sink holding the chipped mug Ethan had set out for her. She looked up when he came down, and something changed in her face when she saw him. Not because he was dramatic, not because he gave speeches, but because he had done exactly what good men do. He had gone back to his child. He had chosen tenderness in the middle of tension. In Claire's world, men often protected what they owned. Ethan protected who he loved. That difference felt enormous. You didn't have to stand up to them, she said quietly. Ethan poured hot water into 2 mugs and dropped tea bags in both. Maybe not, he said, but I wasn't going to let Lily think fear gets the final word in this house. Claire looked down at the steam rising between her hands. My father always says safety comes from control. Ethan handed her a mug. He's wrong. Safety comes from trust. They stood in the kitchen under the low yellow light, the whole little house wrapped in the hush that follows weather. Claire finally told him more. That night, not every detail, not the whole glittering machinery of the Bennett Empire, but enough. The penthouses, the schools chosen for prestige, not joy. The interviews arranged after her mother died because Richard Bennett believed visibility looked stronger than mourning. The way every mistake had become a headline risk, every preference a negotiation, every silence interpreted as rebellion. Ethan did not interrupt. He only listened, one elbow on the table, hands around his mug, giving her that rarest American mercy, space without performance. When she finished, the clock over the stove ticked twice before he spoke. Sounds lonely, he said. Claire laughed once through the tears she had not meant to shed. It was. He nodded, and because he was a man of quiet instincts more than polished wisdom, he said the truest thing first. You don't seem lonely when Lily's talking to you. Claire smiled then, wet-eyed and unguarded. No, she admitted. I don't. By morning the rain had passed. Sunlight spread clean and pale across the yard, catching on the swing under the maple tree and the puddles in the driveway. Lily came down asking for pancakes shaped like stars, as if billionaires and private security and old wounds were things daylight could reduce to shadows. Ethan made the pancakes. Claire set the table without asking. Lily announced this meant Claire officially lived there in the important sense, not just the upstairs sense. Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. Claire laughed, and this time the laughter stayed. It moved through the house like something long overdue. Later, when Ethan drove Lily to school, she looked out the truck window at the bright, wet world and said, Claire smiled with her whole face today. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting near Lily's backpack between them. Yeah, he said. I noticed. Lily nodded, satisfied. I think maybe we helped. Ethan glanced at her small reflection in the glass and felt that old ache soften into something warmer. Maybe that was how healing worked. Not as thunder, not as grand speeches or sudden miracles. Maybe it arrived in a rented room, in a lunch note, in a little girl with a stuffed frog, in a man who kept coming home no matter what stood on the porch. Maybe grace was simply people choosing each other again after life had given them every reason not to. And maybe that was the true secret Claire Bennett found in Millbrook, Ohio. Not escape from money, not rebellion for its own sake, but a home humble enough to tell the truth, a father strong enough to be gentle, a child open enough to welcome sorrow without fearing it. Sometimes the richest thing in the world is not what a billionaire can build for his daughter. It is what an ordinary man can protect with dignity, kindness, and a light left on for whoever needs to find their way in. If this story moved you, if you believe quiet love still matters and second chances still change lives, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories of grace, healing, and the kind of courage that speaks softly but lasts. And before you go, tell me this. When life has broken your trust, what makes a place feel like home again?